Habakkuk lived during one of the darkest periods in Judah's history. It was the end of the 7th century before Christ. The chosen people were in moral, spiritual, and political decline. Justice had been corrupted, leadership was rotten, and the altars of the Lord had been replaced with foreign idols. What was once the nation of the covenant now resembled the pagan nations around it. The prophet could not bear what he saw. He watched society collapse and saw no reaction from heaven. The powerful oppressed the weak. Judges ignored justice. Priests sold themselves. Violence was a daily occurrence. And God seemed silent. Faced with this chaotic scenario, Habakkuk did not remain silent. He didn't fake faith. He asked questions. With courage and honesty, he lifted his voice to heaven and cried out, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, and you do not listen?" But what makes his story so impactful is that God responds. And the answer is not what he expected. In this video, you will discover the surprising journey of a prophet who moved from lament to trust, from despair to mature faith. Habakkuk does not prophesy only to the people of Judah. He speaks with God and teaches us, through that true faith is not the absence of questions, but the courage to wait for answers. Why does God allow evil to prosper? Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked triumph? These questions, asked by Habakkuk over 2,600 years ago, remain as relevant as ever. And what about you? What do you do when everything seems unfair and God is silent? Habakkuk was tired. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was a burden in his soul. The weariness of someone who looks around, day after day, and sees everything collapsing before his own eyes. He was a righteous man, sensitive to what was holy, indignant at what was wicked. And the more he observed what was happening to the people of Judah, the more anguished he became. It was the end of the 7th century before Christ. Judah, the southern kingdom, was no longer what it once had been in the glorious days of David and Solomon. After the death of King Josiah, the last great spiritual reformer, the nation plunged into corruption, idolatry, and injustice. Leaders sold out for bribes. Judges ignored the truth. Priests had become corrupt. The temple was full of rituals but empty of the fear of God. The poor were exploited. Orphans and widows were forgotten. And the people no longer even realized they had abandoned the covenant. Habakkuk saw all of this. And it hurt. Because he knew the law of the Lord. He knew what was right. And more than that, he believed that God was just, holy, and faithful. But then, how could he explain the silence? How could he accept that evil was growing with no judgment? How could he tolerate seeing the righteous crushed while the wicked prospered? With a heart full of indignation, he did what many would not have the courage to do. He questioned God. "How long, Lord, must I call for help, and you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, and you do not save?" Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 2. These words are not cold. They burn. They are full of pain, frustration, and, paradoxically, faith. Because only someone who believes God is listening questions his silence. Only someone who still hopes for an answer dares to cry out. Habakkuk was not rejecting faith, he was fighting to preserve it in the midst of chaos. He continues his prayer, "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me, there is strife, and conflict abounds." Chapter 1, verse 3. The prophet is saying, "Lord, do you see what I see? How is it possible that evil advances and the righteous are silenced, and yet heaven remains silent?" Habakkuk's honesty is disconcerting. He is not afraid to speak to God the way his heart feels. He isn't concerned with sounding pious or balanced. He is suffering, and he knows the only place he can bring his pain is before God. He does not represent an idealized faith, distant from reality. He represents a living, real, struggling faith, but firm enough not to run from God's presence. Unlike other prophets, Habakkuk does not begin his message by addressing the people. He does not rebuke the kings or the priests. He does not proclaim judgment. He prays. Or rather, he protests before God. He speaks to heaven, not to the earth. His first prophetic mission is to lay bare his own heart. And that is powerful. Because in many moments, our journey with God doesn't start with certainty, but with questions. It doesn't begin with praise, but with lament. And that's okay. Habakkuk shows us that God is not offended by sincere questions. On the contrary, he reveals himself through them. At that time, Judah also lived under the threat of a new foreign power, Babylon. The Assyrian Empire was crumbling, and the Babylonians, with their brutal and militarized strength, were becoming increasingly feared. They conquered nations quickly, spreading fear, destruction, and idolatry wherever they went. Habakkuk knew Judah would not be able to withstand this threat for long. And what tormented him most was the thought, would God use an even more wicked nation to punish Judah? How could that be just? Still, the focus of the chapter is not on the Babylonians. It is on the heart of a man who feels justice has been abandoned, that sacred values have been reversed, and that evil has become routine. He describes, therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Chapter 1, verse 4. It is a strong accusation. Justice has been hijacked. The law has lost its power. The courts are corrupt. The truth has been silenced. And in this scenario, the prophet cries out. He doesn't try to organize a revolution. He doesn't propose a political strategy. He doesn't call the people to arms. He bends his knees, but not in silence. Habakkuk lifts his voice, his anguish, his pain. And he waits. Waiting is an act of faith. Perhaps the hardest of all. Because it requires believing that God is listening even when he doesn't respond. It demands trusting that, despite the apparent abandonment, the Lord is still sovereign. Habakkuk doesn't have answers yet. But he has taken the first step. He didn't run away. He sought. He opened his heart before God. And that, in itself, is already a sign of faith. Habakkuk represents all those who have ever prayed without a reply. All who have seen the world fall apart around them while heaven remains silent. All who have looked at injustice and asked, "Where's God?" The question is not new. But it is sincere. And when it comes from a heart that loves justice and knows God's character, it is not a threat to faith, it is the soil where faith grows. Habakkuk is beginning his journey. He doesn't yet know how God will respond. But he is ready to listen. And that changes everything. Habakkuk had asked his questions. He had exposed his pain. Now, he waited. But what he didn't expect was that God's answer would be as surprising as it was unsettling. The Lord responded. And he responded clearly, directly, and even shockingly. Not with promises of immediate restoration. Not with gentle comfort. God spoke of judgment. But not in the way the prophet expected. God revealed a plan that not only defied human logic, but also challenged the faith of the very messenger. Look among the nations and watch, be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 5. The answer begins with a call to attention. God was about to do something great and terrifying. Something that would astonish even the most faithful. It was as if he were saying, "You want answers? Get ready, because the answer will shake you." And then God reveals it. He would raise up Babylon. A ruthless, brutal, arrogant people. A cruel empire that marched through the nations, conquering with violence and leaving a trail of destruction. And it would be these very Babylonians, the Chaldeans, that God would use as his instrument to bring judgment upon Judah. Habakkuk had asked for justice. and God, in his sovereignty, was answering. But not in the way the prophet expected. The description of the Babylonians that God gives is astonishing. They are portrayed as fierce, swift, and ravenous. Their horses are faster than leopards. Their warriors more impetuous than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry swoops in like a hungry eagle. They come to do violence, they mock kings, laugh at fortresses, and gather power as if they were gods themselves. They believe their own strength is their God. Verses 6 to 11. To Habakkuk, this made no sense. It was as if God were trading evil for something worse. Yes, Judah was in sin. Yes, justice had been twisted. But how could judgment come through a people even more wicked? How could God's holiness be reconciled with the use of such a cruel instrument? It was like watching a sick city being treated with poison. The remedy seemed worse than the disease. Babylon was known for its brutality. It massacred the innocent, destroyed cities, dragged entire peoples into captivity. And now, this nation would be the arm of God? It was a revelation too difficult to accept. Habakkuk, who until now had spoken with courage, now finds himself crushed by a reality that doesn't fit within his faith. But he doesn't run away. He doesn't end the conversation. On the contrary, he continues. But this time, with even more bewilderment. Lord, are you not from everlasting, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. Chapter 1, verse 12. Habakkuk's reaction is twofold. He reaffirms his faith, but insists on his questioning. He knows God is eternal. He knows God would not completely destroy his people, for there is a covenant. He calls God Rock, a symbol of stability, trust, and security. But even so, he still can't understand. He asks, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrongdoing, why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Verse 13. Here, Habakkuk is faced with the greatest theological dilemma of faith. How can a just God allow injustice? How can a holy God use an evil people to correct another? He uses vivid imagery. He compares the Babylonians to fishermen, casting their nets and catching people as if they were helpless fish. They rejoice in their own violence. They sacrifice to their nets, as if their weapons were divine. They treat nations as prey and war as sport. And then the prophet cries out, will they keep on emptying their nets, destroying nations without mercy forever? Verse 17. Habakkuk is desperate. And, at the same time, he is aware of something. He doesn't have the full picture. His vision is limited. His understanding cannot grasp the entirety of what God is doing. So he makes a decision. One of the most beautiful declarations of faith in the entire Old Testament. I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower. I will look out to see what he will say to me, and what answer I will give to my complaint. Chapter 2, verse 1. Habakkuk positions himself as a watchman. Someone who, even without understanding, is willing to wait for an answer. He is anguished, yes. Confused, yes. But he is also alert. Hopeful. He chooses to wait for the word of the Lord. That decision reveals a lot. Habakkuk is not abandoning faith. On the contrary, he is deepening it. He is moving beyond the kind of faith that only believes when it understands. Now, he stands in the faith that waits, even without understanding. He knew God's ways were higher than his own. He knew divine justice was not limited by human time. But between knowing and accepting, there is a path. And that is the path the prophet now begins to walk. How often do we feel the same way? We pray asking for help. We cry out for justice. And when God answers, the answer isn't what we expected. Sometimes, it even looks worse in our eyes. It feels like, instead of a solution, more pain came. And then we ask ourselves, did I misunderstand? Is God really seeing? Habakkuk teaches us that faith doesn't always bring immediate answers. Sometimes, it leads us to even deeper questions. And it's in that process that something changes within us. God is not ignoring. He is building. He is shaping. He is preparing. The prophet had cried out, and God had answered. But the answer didn't end the conflict, it deepened it. And even so, Habakkuk remains before the Lord, in silence, waiting. This chapter of the story doesn't end in relief, but in expectation. Heaven responded. But the prophet's heart is still full of doubt. He remains at the watchtower. Not because he understands everything, but because he chooses to trust that the final answer will come from above. Habakkuk was silent. But it was not the silence of someone giving up, it was the silence of one who waits with reverence. He had climbed his watchtower, like a spiritual sentinel. Not to control the situation, but to observe. Not to plan a reaction, but to listen. The prophet placed himself before God as someone who acknowledges his limitations and, even so, chooses to trust that the Lord will speak at the right time. And God spoke. The divine response begins with a command already full of meaning: write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that a runner may read it. Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 2. It would not be just a word for that moment. It was a revelation for all generations. A message that would transcend Judah's crisis and echo to the ends of history. It was something that needed to be recorded, read, meditated upon, and preserved. Then God says, for the vision awaits its appointed time, it hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it, it will surely come, it will not delay. Verse 3. This statement is both a comfort and a challenge. God is saying, justice will come. Not in your time, but in mine. He reaffirms that he is not inactive, that he has not abandoned control. But he also teaches something essential: divine timing does not follow human urgency. Habakkuk wanted immediate answers. He wanted to see the wicked judged, the righteous defended, order restored. But God was not merely addressing Judah's crisis. He was revealing an eternal truth, much greater than one historical moment. And that truth is revealed in a single sentence, a sentence that would span centuries and transform the faith of millions: the righteous shall live by faith. Verse 4, with this declaration, God reveals the heart of his justice. He shows that true life, the life that endures, that transcends time, that overcomes chaos, is not based on strength, on human wisdom, or on the absence of problems. It is based on faith. Faith not as an abstract feeling, but as an active, firm, persevering trust. A total surrender to who God is, even when we do not understand what he does. This phrase is the turning point of the book of Habakkuk. It is also one of the pillars of Christian faith. Later, the Apostle Paul would quote it in Romans, chapter 1, verse 17, and in Galatians, chapter 3, verse 11, to affirm that salvation does not come by works, but by faith. The writer of Hebrews also repeats it in chapter 10, verse 38, emphasizing that, in times of persecution and uncertainty, it is faith that sustains the righteous. For Habakkuk, this revelation changes everything. Because until then, he was trapped in a dilemma: why does God allow evil to prosper? How can a holy God use a wicked people? But now, he understands that God's justice is not limited to visible acts of immediate intervention. God's justice is founded on his eternal faithfulness, and the righteous, those who walk with him, must learn to live not by what they see, but by what they believe. God continues his response by describing the sins of the Babylonians. They are proud, greedy, violent, idolatrous. They build cities with blood, seek glory for themselves, and become drunk with power. But the Lord assures, those who now seem invincible will also be judged. The destruction they sow will return upon them. The cycle of evil will not go unpunished. In the midst of this description of the coming judgment, God declares something that lights up the entire scene: for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Verse 14. This is the final vision. This is the full plan that Habakkuk could not see at the beginning. While the prophet saw only chaos and silence, God saw the fullness of redemption. Justice was not being ignored, it was being built on levels the prophet could not yet grasp. The Lord ends his speech with a majestic statement, "But the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him." Verse 20. This phrase is powerful. God is on the throne. He reigns. He sees everything. Nothing escapes his gaze. No matter how confusing the world may seem, the Lord remains sovereign. In light of this truth, the whole earth must be silent. Not in fear, but in reverence. Habakkuk now sees. He still doesn't understand everything, but he sees beyond. The faith that once questioned now trusts. The soul that once cried out for answers now surrenders to the presence of the Holy One. He has learned that God does not reveal himself only through explanations, but through presence. And his presence is enough to sustain the soul of the righteous. How many times do we also wait for explanations? We want to know the why behind every suffering, every silence, every injustice we witness. And when the answers don't come the way we hoped, we feel the weight of doubt. But God, just as he did with Habakkuk, invites us to something greater, not just to understand, but to believe. Not just to see justice done now, but to trust that it will come, in the right time, with the right glory, in the perfect way. The phrase "the righteous shall live by faith" is not a pretty phrase for a picture frame. It is a calling. A summons to spiritual maturity. An invitation to walk with God even when the steps are covered by the fog of uncertainty. Habakkuk didn't receive what he asked for. But he received something much greater, the revelation that God's justice does not fail, even when it delays. And that the secret to enduring all of this is faith. The prophet began this journey crying out, weeping, wrestling. But now, he stands. Not because circumstances have changed, but because his vision of God has been transformed. He has learned that living by faith is choosing to trust even when we do not see. It is remaining firm even when the world seems to collapse. He knows that Babylon will come. He knows that Judah will suffer. But now, above all, he knows that the Lord is in his holy temple, and that his justice will not fail. Habakkuk waited for an answer. God gave him a vision. And that vision would change everything. Habakkuk heard God's response. It was a response that didn't ease his pain, but expanded his vision. The prophet who once saw only chaos now realized there was order behind the events, a divine order, often incomprehensible, but always just. He understood that God's judgment doesn't always come as we expect, and that the Lord's justice doesn't require human approval to be perfect. His faith was transformed. Before, it was a faith supported by logic. If God is good, then he must act quickly. Now, it was a faith sustained by trust. God is good, even when he doesn't act the way I expect. With this new vision, Habakkuk not only fell silent before the Lord but allowed his soul to find rest. And from the silence that once afflicted him, reverence now emerged. This inward shift, from crisis to confidence, gave rise to something extraordinary, a prayer in the form of a song. It was no longer a complaint or a protest. It was a heartfelt response from someone who had learned to trust in God's character above his circumstances. This is what shapes the third and final chapter of his book, one of the most profound and poetic prayers in the entire Bible. The text begins with reverence. Lord, I have heard of your fame, I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day, in our time make them known, in wrath remember mercy. Habakkuk doesn't ignore God's wrath, nor does he ask for it to be removed. He understands that divine justice must be fulfilled. But he pleads that even in the midst of judgment, God will not forget compassion. This is mature faith, one that doesn't seek to avoid suffering, but desires to go through it hand in hand with the Lord's mercy. Habakkuk begins to recall the great deeds of God in the past. It's as if he turns his eyes to the history of Israel and tells himself, the same God who acted yesterday is still God today. He remembers divine manifestations in the wilderness, the plagues of Egypt, the earthquakes, the signs that showed the Lord was not indifferent. The image he paints is of a grand, fearsome God in power, but utterly faithful to his people. In this song, the prophet isn't merely describing what God has done. He is renewing his trust in who God is. Remembering divine action gives him strength to endure the present. Even knowing that difficult times were coming, he was no longer ruled by fear. The vision of the Lord marching with majesty across the earth gave him peace. God's sovereignty was no longer a theoretical concept for him, it had become the solid ground beneath his feet. But that doesn't mean he stopped feeling. Habakkuk describes honestly, "I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound, decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled." The prophet is saying he still feels fear. He still trembles before the pain ahead. He knows suffering has not been removed from the path. But something has changed, now he chooses to wait patiently. No longer in protest, but in submission. He says, "I will wait quietly for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us." From here, he delivers one of the most powerful declarations of biblical faith. A declaration that doesn't rely on favorable circumstances or visible promises. He writes, "Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will be joyful in God my Savior." This is not cheap optimism. It is mature faith. Faith that has learned to trust not in what God gives, but in who God is. Habakkuk sees no change in the political scene, nor in the state of the nation. Judah will still face Babylon. The harvest will fail. The economy will collapse. But the prophet's heart is steadfast, not because things changed, but because he did. Now he understands that joy doesn't have to depend on what is happening around him, it is born from an unshakable conviction in the character of the Lord. The prayer ends with a declaration of strength, "The sovereign Lord is my strength, he makes my feet like the feet of a deer, he enables me to tread on the heights." It's the image of an agile, sure-footed animal running across mountains without falling. Habakkuk is saying that even if the path is hard, God will enable him to move forward. Even if the terrain is unstable, the Lord will make him stand firm. He began the journey with cries of anguish. He ends with a song of trust. He went from the depths of despair to the heights of faith. Not because everything was resolved, but because he learned to rest in God's sovereignty. This is the kind of transformation only the presence of the Lord can bring. The story of Habakkuk shows us that faith doesn't always change our circumstances. Sometimes, it changes the heart of the one walking through them. The world around us may still be in chaos, but within those who believe, there is a peace that cannot be explained, only experienced. Habakkuk's song had ended, but the impact of his words echoed beyond his time. What he wrote was not just a personal outcry or a poetic prayer. It was a declaration of faith in its purest, rawest, and most real form. And it wasn't just for Judah. It was for all those who would one day live through uncertain times, gray days, moments where faith seems to be the only thing standing when everything else falls apart. The phrase "the righteous shall live by faith," which God himself had spoken to him, now became a foundation. An anchor. A lens through which Habakkuk began to see the world. He had come to understand that faith is not an escape from reality, but a different way of facing it. It's not about closing your eyes to what is wrong, but about keeping your eyes fixed on the one who remains right, even when everything around you seems wrong. Judah would still suffer. Babylon was still coming. The destruction would be real, the losses painful, and the future filled with unanswered questions. But now the prophet knew where his heart needed to be firmly rooted. He had gone from being a man dominated by circumstances to someone walking above them, even if his feet still trembled. This silent transformation within him is perhaps the most powerful part of his entire story. because it is the same transformation many people need today. In the midst of wars, illnesses, tragic news, overdue bills, closed doors, human disappointment, and internal and external collapse, the calling remains the same: live by faith. Not a shallow faith, conditioned by what God can do for us, but a deep faith that rests in who God is, even when He chooses not to explain. Habakkuk had learned to let go of the need for control. When he climbed his watchtower to wait for God's answer, he still wanted to understand. He still needed explanations. But when he came down, after the vision, he no longer sought logic. He wanted presence. He longed for the certainty that the Lord was in His holy temple, reigning, even in silence. Mature faith is like that. It keeps going even when it doesn't understand. It endures even when everything around it roars in confusion. It chooses to trust without seeing and to worship without feeling. It doesn't depend on daily proof to stand firm, because it already knows God is trustworthy, even when life is unpredictable. This kind of faith isn't born from doctrine alone. It is born from pain, from frustration, from the collision between what we believe and what we experience. It was in the friction between those two realities that Habakkuk found the essence of trust. He realized he didn't need to understand the full plan in order to trust the heart of the planner. In truth, living by faith is not a heroic act. It's a simple yet profound choice, to not let go of God's hand, even when the lights go out. That's what he meant when he wrote, "Though the fig tree does not blossom," it's not about embracing suffering as if it were good. It's about recognizing that, even when the scenery is devastating, God is still God. Joy doesn't grow from the harvest, it grows from communion. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of true faith. It requires us to take our eyes off the results and turn them toward the source. To let go of the expectation of a life without losses and learn to find peace in God's presence, even if the bread is lacking, even if the harvest fails, even if the fig tree withers. Habakkuk also teaches us that faith needs to be written. When God told him to record the vision on tablets, He was saying something beyond paper. He was saying, etch this. Not just with ink, but with soul. What God reveals in the midst of chaos must be memorized, sealed in the heart, because chaos will return. The storm passes, but it also comes back. And when it returns, it's the memory of what God has already spoken that sustains the righteous. This is the kind of faith that doesn't depend on the now. It's the faith that transcends generations. It was this same faith that sustained the persecuted Christians of the early church. The same faith that gave strength to men and women during the dark ages of church history. The same faith rediscovered by Luther when he read in Romans, chapter 1, verse 17, "The righteous shall live by faith." And it's this same faith that needs to be awakened today in hearts that are tired, frustrated, or discouraged. You don't have to be a prophet to see that the world is off balance. Just open your eyes. Injustice still runs rampant. Corruption still kills. The innocent still suffer. Evil still seems to have the last word. And sometimes, heaven still feels as quiet as in Habakkuk's day. But God's answer remains the same: wait. Trust. Live by faith. Because justice will come. Maybe not today. Maybe not in the way we expect. But it will come. The glory of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And until then, we are called to walk like those who already know this. Like those who have seen even without seeing. Like those who have understood even without understanding everything. Habakkuk did not change Judah's immediate destiny. But his faith, recorded in that small 3-chapter book, crossed centuries and reached us today. Because when someone chooses to live by faith, even in chaos, their story becomes stronger than the chaos itself. Habakkuk's story ends without a change in the scenery, but with transformation in the heart. He did not see Babylon defeated. He didn't witness the end of injustice in Judah. But he saw something many never do, that God's faithfulness does not depend on time, circumstances, or our understanding. He learned that living by faith is not a theory, it's a path. A way to breathe when the air is gone. A way to walk even when the road disappears. A lifestyle that says, even if everything fails, I will not let go of God's hand. Today, the message that crossed centuries echoes here and now. Because chaos is still among us. The world still has more questions than answers. And heaven, at times, still seems silent. But now, the voice of Habakkuk reminds us, God's silence is not absence, it is construction. It is in the waiting that faith is refined. It is in the delay that trust deepens. It is in the apparent lack of meaning that the presence of the Lord becomes strongest. Life may not bloom the way you expected. The fig tree may not bear fruit. The vines may fail. The harvest may not come. The barns may be empty. But even so, the God of your salvation remains. He is your strength. He sustains you. He leads you to higher places. And that is why today, if this message has touched your heart, I invite you to take one step beyond doubt and plant your feet in faith. Not the kind of faith that waits for everything to go right, but the kind of faith that trusts even when everything seems wrong. The faith that lives. The faith that sustains. The faith that refuses to let go of the Lord, even without understanding His ways. Take a moment now to reflect. Are you living by faith or only by logic? Are you resting in God or only in what you can control? Today's challenge is this: choose to trust. Choose to stay. Choose to rejoice in God, even though, in spite of it all. Say a sincere prayer like Habakkuk. No masks. No rehearsed phrases. Just you and God. Say what you feel. And then, be still. Not to escape, but to listen. Because He still speaks. And the vision still comes. Even if it delays, it will not fail. And if this story spoke to you, share it. Someone near you may also be struggling with God's silence. May this word reach many other hearts. Until the next video, where we continue together, discovering stories that build, encourage, and remind us, the righteous shall live by faith.